you enjoyed that first opening keynote. I know I did. And I am now really ecstatic, enthusiastic for the panel that's going to follow it, which is going to pick up on a lot of similar themes in conversation, but bring in obviously a whole set of new expertise and perspective on the issues. So this is our first panel. It's titled Ethical Boundaries and Obligations of Communicating Science. Pretty big and lofty. We've got a lot of interesting threads that we're going to pull out today. I'm pleased to be joined by 4 really awesome people who bring in really unique experience and perspective to this panel. We have Fabien Medvechy. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Otago in New Zealand. At least for right now, we know he's going to transition to a new position here in the next year. Fabien is a social epidemiologist who studies the relationship between knowledge and society, and how social interactions shape, create, and direct what counts as knowledge. He's got a strong focus on science communication and its applications in economics, which is great. And literally, when I was looking into this topic, I saw that he literally wrote the book and the ethics of science communication with his colleague, Joan Leach. So Fabien, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Very much looking forward to it.
Great. We also have Maya Goldenberg. Maya is a professor of philosophy, so we got another philosophy person here at the University of Guelph in Ontario. Her research asks the questions, how do we know what to believe in healthcare? Among other questions she likes to research. She wrote the book, Vaccine Hesitancy, Public Trust, Expertise in the War on Science. I have yet to read it, but I'm really excited to snag that and give it a read here soon. Maya, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
We also have Monica Fia-Moher, an award-winning science communicator and the Director of Communications and Science Outreach for Ciencia Puerto Rico, an organization where they transform the way science and scientists are presented in the media, as well as promoting science and research in Puerto Rico. She is also the Director of Inclusive Science Communication for the Science Communication Lab, and focuses on making science more equitable and inclusive. Monica, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And our host and guide for today's conversation is Flora Lichtman. Flora is a science communicator. She's a podcaster, which those of you who know the Institute, we've got podcasting deep in our veins as well. But she is extremely impressive. She has been working in radio and podcast and video for almost 20 years. She created and hosted the podcast Every Little Things for Spotify, for those of you who haven't listened to it. I know, unfortunately, last fall was the end of last year. You all wrapped up. I listened to that closing episode of Every Little Things last year. But it was a really amazing podcast for 5 years. She's worked with Bill Nye. She's been on Science Friday. She's written for the New York Times, as well as many more. She has very impressive credentials. Let me turn this over. Flora, thank you for being here today and for guiding our conversation. I'm going to bow out and let you take it from here. Everyone enjoy.
Thank you so much for that very generous intro. Okay, so I wanted to start with just a little bit about defining terms. So we're talking about ethics and science communication, and I kind of want to define what we mean by that. Are we talking about the ethics of why we need to communicate about science, or whether we need to communicate science, or how we should be communicating about science? Maya, let's go to you first.
I think the answer is both. So the goals of ethic of communications are multiple. It was detailed in the opening talk today. We're trying to help the public be more informed about the science that impacts their life, about policy decisions that their elected officials are making. We'd also like people to be supportive of funding science, at least funding science that is worth funding, and having people excited and interested in science in general. So it's important to do it for that reason. So there are moral arguments for why we should be communicating science, and it shouldn't just be held by the scientists or in academic circles. But there's also, because it's got such significant impact on our lives, there are questions about how it should be communicated, how we should be sharing information with the public, and also receiving feedback from the publics.
Fabien, I know you wrote a book with this very title, so do you have anything to add to this sort of framework of what this discussion should be about?
No, I mean, I think I agree with Maya that it's all of the above. I think they feed into one another. I mean, I think part of how you communicate science, or part of the ethics of the practice of communicating science, is motivated by the reasons you have for communicating science. I think that's part of that ethical reflection, right? Part of practicing science communication well or ethically involves thinking about why you need to do it and which bit you do need to communicate. I don't think we should communicate all science all the time. I think that's part of that reflection, is to think about why you need to communicate it, when you need to communicate it to, who to, all this kind of thing. So for me, these are embedded and intertwined discussions and processes. I think it's one big messy bundle of ethical reflection.
Who gets to decide what counts as ethical in science communication?
I mean, I think that's an important question.
I think Monica should answer this.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. I think when I think about ethics in the context of anything, but here in science communication, first, I think not just about not doing harm, but about redressing injustices. It's not just about currently not harming everyone, but keeping in mind there are people that have been harmed by science. And so how do we bring injustice into the equation? That's a big part of what I do. And I think there is a question of power. Historically, science and the science communication, and still currently, it's predominated by white, Western, global North perspectives, meaning the US, Canada, Europe, Australia. And so decisions, what science is important, what questions are asked, how science is interpreted, it's driven by those dominant perspectives. So that means that there are many, many people that are overlooked, that are systemically excluded. And so I think in asking the question of who gets to decide what's ethical, who gets to decide what is communicated, how and when, we need to think about those historical and current injustices and how do we address them.
I think it also might be useful to think about other areas of communication that have ethical norms. So I think media ethics is more familiar to people. We talk about freedom of the press, and people seem to understand what that means and why that's important. We want diversity of opinions. We want media that isn't just pandering to government propaganda or to the corporations that own their newspapers or news outlets. So that's already giving us a hint at what kind of communications people are looking for, at least vis-a-vis media, but that's actually true about science as well. People are looking for unbiased information coming from a diversity of perspectives, and not just feeding the interests of the powerful, but feeding the interests of everybody.
Actually, and I think this is probably something that's interesting, to pick up one aspect that I think, almost in addition to Heather's talk, I think was mostly focused on this scientists and scientific community communicating to the public, but there's also an aspect of communication of that other move of bringing views of the public back towards science. So how we communicate to scientists, because for me, communication is two ways. It goes in all sorts of directions. And so I think there's something interesting here to think in terms also of how we do this ethically, what counts as ethical, who decides on this, is also asking members of society to speak back to scientists about what counts as ethical from a social perspective. There's also, and for me, that's actually also part of science communication, is making that space available to reflect back on what counts as ethical, both for science and for science communication.
Monica, this feels like up your alley, because I know that you work a lot with community outreach. Do you have thoughts on this, about how to engage the public in a sort of two-way conversation about what ethical communication is?
Yeah, I think science communication in general, we talk about science communication, but when I think about science communication, I think about engagement, which is what I think we're talking about is that conversation, that dialogue, that exchange of knowledge, of experiences. I think traditionally science communication, it's still what predominates is this deficit model, this idea, if you provide information, people are going to change their mind, they're going to do what's quote unquote right, and then we're all good. And we know that that's not true. We know that that deficit model, that presumption of what's happening, it's just a lack of information. That's just wrong.
Well, there's research to show that this is wrong.
Yes,
it's not about more facts.
Exactly. It's not about more facts. Data doesn't speak for itself. Facts alone are not going to change things. We need to consider other things like people's values, their identities, their culture. There are many things that go into how people understand, engage, and value science. So I think it's really, really important that we take into account people's culture, their contexts, their realities. I've been having conversations with my team at Ciencia Puerto Rico this week about, what does it mean to convey science to people and like engage people with science about the importance of, getting vaccinated, doing anything that we say it's like science says is good for you if people are not having essential needs met. In Puerto Rico, there's been a conversation about students not going to secondary education, so just finishing high school and not going to college or pursuing other types of education. And there's a survey that found that one of the big challenges is students face food insecurity. And so I think it's really important in the context of science communication, we consider things like this, where if we're going to engage with a community, we need to understand what are the needs and, are they going to care about science if they don't have their community is not safe, if they don't have food. I think it's really, really important that we consider context and that we center those audiences, those partners, because sometimes as scientists, we come in, we have an interest, we have a goal to communicate or engage people with science, and we're not thinking about those realities that are really going to impact whether people are going to engage with us or not.
I want to just underline this because I think this deficit model idea, the idea that facts, just better explanation, more facts, really underpins a lot of science media. That's the field that I work in. And I see a lot of science media really focused on, well, let's just do a better explainer. And if we do a better explainer, surely people will understand. And so I want to just take a moment to really underline this because I think it's pervasive, not just in the sort of scientific field, at least in my field, in science media. I think this, even though there's data to back up that this doesn't work, it's still the predominant mode of communication. And I guess that's just a statement, but I wonder if Maya, Fabien, if you have thoughts about that.
Well, I agree with what you just said 100%. And I would like to know why it persists. There's something about the science deficit that it won't go away despite decades of research saying otherwise. During COVID, I thought there was actually more of it. So I track vaccine media outreach pretty closely. And it seemed like I'll describe it, but the COVID myth versus fact kind of infographic was everywhere. And I was trying to figure out why it seemed to be growing during the COVID period. I had some thoughts on it, but none of it has been.
Yeah, theories. Tell me, I'm so curious.
I thought that it was a lot of healthcare practitioners and scientists started to do grassroots science communications during the COVID period. They had good reason to do it. Many were stuck at home. They were frustrated. They wanted to help with the, war on misinformation that we keep hearing about. So they did what they knew best. They wanted to share the facts that they knew. Scientists who are not necessarily well trained in communication figure that that's what's missing. The reflex seems to be that if only the public knew what I knew, then they would think like me. And there is some social science research to suggest that many scientists do think that way about the public, that they're not so smart. And if I could just help them along, then they would think like me. So it seemed like that was an easy way to contribute to something that they thought was worthwhile. So I think the intention was good, but in many ways, I think it made it worse.
There's some irony here, right? Because these are scientists not actually having their minds changed by data, right? Mm-hmm. Which is like the problem that we're seeing with the deficit model with the public too, right? Like it's just strikes me as interesting. I mean, if it's not about explaining the science better, are there specific case studies where you've seen science communication work when it comes to climate or vaccines or another issue?
I think one aspect that we know very well, and in fact, it is the importance of group membership and having the right speaker, the right person. And the right person doesn't necessarily even need to provide more information. The right person can simply provide the right leadership. We know this is very, very effective. We know this in terms of communication and engagement around almost any topic. The person, the messenger matters as much as the message, if not more. And so, to give you some example, in New Zealand, where I am currently, we had similar aspects where some of the Maori communities were not particularly trusting or had low vaccination rates, partially because of historical backgrounds, and perfectly reasonable if you take it into context. But of course, what wasn't done at the beginning, what was really needed, was to have the right community leaders provide the information, rather than have the government come down and say, this is what's good for you and what you need to do, because historically that's not necessarily been the best thing to do. And going on with that same trope, or that same move, isn't particularly either effective or persuasive or helpful on any level. And that experience, I think, has been replicated across the world in so many contexts, that having the right person speak matters most.
So who's delivering the message is one thing to consider.
Absolutely.
Are there what about evolution? When I started my career in science media, it was very polarizing. There was a lot of arguments about what belongs in a textbook. I know this is happening still to some degree, but it doesn't feel like the dominant science story anymore. Is there anything we can learn from communication around evolution?
There was a recent American survey that came out showing that there is a lot less polarization around the theory of evolution. The question had been, is a theory of evolution a good way of explaining how humans have come to be the way they are? I don't have the exact phrasing. And they found a lot less polarization than there'd been maybe 10 years ago. And the difference was 10 years ago, evolution was much more in the news and being questioned whether it had a place in the school curriculum, whether we should be doing the both sides kind of discussion about it. So so evolution at that time was igniting certain values and ideologies around religion, around science, around the place of religion in public schools and that kind of thing. It seems that because it's quieted since then, that we can now talk about evolution without creating those kind of defenses that, let's say, religious people and believers might feel, that in fact now we can talk about evolution being a good scientific theory without challenging your belief in God or some kind of higher power.
Can I jump in here, Matt? Because I think there's also an interesting aspect about, it's not just religious people who were very, very emotive about evolution. There were a number of scientists who were evangelically engaged with that debate. On the other side, right, the kind of evangelical atheists, who I think were as much provoking this kind of reaction by their super forthright kind of discussion, which in a way, I think, in terms of the ethics of communication, what does your communication do in terms of not just providing information, but also aggravating positions, forcing kind of, confrontations, as opposed to allowing collaborative discourses? And I'm thinking, there's a bunch of people we can all think of, 10, 15 years ago, who were very forthright in their view that everyone in the world should be an atheist.
Right. So Dawkins, people like that?
Exactly, yeah. Right, Dawkins, Krauss, and so forth, who certainly had a role. And there's a real ethical question about then, what do you do in these conversations? You might have a view, but what is your communication doing to the debate and the social structure?
I absolutely agree with what you're saying, Fabien. It's really a question about how we frame the debate. So communicators need to think clearly about that. So if you're framing it as you're either with us or you're with them, you're forcing people to pick a side, as opposed to framing it differently in less polarizing discourse, where you don't have to, let's say, by accepting evolution, I'm also accepting a number of values and ideas that I may not share, that I may not be truly committed to, like saying, disavowing my religious background, or committing to atheism or something like that. When in fact it turns out we can talk about theory of evolution without committing to all those other things or demanding that others commit to those things.
Are there examples where, in the evolution example, we're talking about how you don't want to pin values or sort of make people choose between values, right? But are there times in science communication where you can actually tap into people's value system rather than just saying like, oh, this is not going to negate your value system? Can we actually piggyback on people's values to communicate more ethically? Monica, I see you nodding.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think it's, I've said this already, but it's incredibly important that we take into account people's culture, their values, their identities. There are things that are more salient for people. We all contain multitudes, right? But, if you ask me, one of my most salient identities for me, it's the fact that I am Puerto Rican. And so that for me means a lot. That defines a lot of who I am, of what I do, of how I think. And so we need to consider these realities when we're engaging with people, when we're trying to understand how they're understanding, how they're valuing science. Have one of the things that I've been doing for the past almost 3 years in Puerto Rico is, as you mentioned, Flora, working with community groups, particularly community leaders in Puerto Rico, who play a really important role where they live. They're trusted. They are often meeting needs that are going unmet by incompetent government and institutions. And so they play a really important role in their communities and taking care of them and making things happen. And during the pandemic, we've been doing a lot of work with these community leaders to increase their capacity to promote health in their communities. And we had one example of a community leader who for a long time, she was skeptical about vaccines. And she's shared with us, I didn't want to get vaccinated. And now I've had, however many doses that, are recommended for folks. And one of the things that she expresses, that engagement with us, those constant conversations about the benefits and limitations of vaccines, of the risk and benefits of getting vaccinated, but most importantly for her, how that would be good for her family and her community. That was a big motivation for her to overcome her skepticism and say, I'm going to get vaccinated because I want to be an example for my community. I want to be able to see my children and my grandchildren. And so because in the relationship that we've built with her and other community leaders, we really center who they are, what they care about, what matters to them, what are their questions, what are their fears. That really informs the relationship that we build with people. We've been able to successfully help some folks overcome skepticism about vaccines. So it's incredibly important that we center these things when we are communicating science.
We got a great question from the audience that I want your thoughts on. So the question is the use of personal vulnerability, a personal vulnerability story, is that useful for reaching some that may not otherwise listen? And is that ethical or is it manipulative?
I'd love to respond to that a little bit if I can jump in.
Please,
I mean,
yes,
I think
yes.
there's a really, really interesting debate around ethical moves in science communication, around not being persuasive. There's a real discomfort with persuasive communication. And I think this goes down to, Heather talks about the value-free ideal in science. It's this idea that science should be providing the facts, this information. And I think that translates into science communication. I think that's also part of the story about the attraction of the information deficit model. We'll just provide the information. We're not trying to persuade you to do anything. We're just going to provide you the information. Of course, you should do the right thing once you have it. But, that's another thing. We just want to provide you with the information. I think we need to be okay with persuasion. Persuasion is the center of all communication. Every academic engages in persuasion. Every time they write a paper, we write a paper, and we hope to persuade the reviewers that they should publish it. If you don't hope for your paper to be published, you shouldn't write the damn thing, right? Persuasion is central to science. We are okay with persuasion. There's a distinction between persuasion, manipulation, and coercion. They're not the same thing. So persuasion is okay. There's real questions to ask. When is it okay for me to persuade somebody else? When is it not? We should reflect on this, but we shouldn't inherently move away from something that is persuasive. And in this case, I don't think the question is about manipulation. Using a personal story is persuasive. For me, the way in my mind I kind of make a crass boundaries, they're fluffy, they're not clear. But I think of persuasion as trying to persuade somebody, trying to get somebody to behave in a certain way. Manipulation for me is when you're doing it, knowing that it may not be in their best interest. So there's an intention there that's kind of unpleasant. And for me, coercion is when you're doing it against their will. And of course, these are not clear boundaries, but they're crass, useful distinction in my head. And I think we should be okay with persuasion. We need to reflect as to whether or not we are engaged in manipulation. But I think we need to become comfortable with this idea that we are going to persuade, because of course we persuade. Mm-hmm. Of course we persuade in everything that we say. We choose what we say, we choose what we don't say. That's always persuasive.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Fabien. I mean, to answer the first part of the question, yes, it is useful. You have to, I think you have to reflect on when is it useful, what are the stories that you're sharing. I mean, I think you have to wrestle with the ethics of these things, but we have to also accept, I'm a scientist by training, and I have to accept science is not objective, period. We've been told that, we've been made believe that. It is false. It is not objective. Science is done by humans. Humans are biased. End of the discussion. I mean, we can continue discussing, but that is, it's just not, science is just not objective. And so we also have to accept that we have motivations. You know, what motivates me to do the work that I do is I believe science can be good for people. I believe science can be a tool against oppression, and it can be a tool for liberation for people, in my case, in Puerto Rico, in a colonized place. So I believe those things, and I am upfront about those things. Those are part of my motivations. I also have to be aware and open about my biases. You know, I have, my perspectives are informed by who I am, by my lived experiences. And there are things I just don't know because I haven't lived through them. So I have to accept and recognize those things inform how I see, I interpret the world, how I do things. And so I think we have to be okay with the fact that there's no such thing as a scientist who's objective or who's not biased, because that's just, we're human.
You know, I've heard over the years from many scientists that, this is picking up on what you were talking about, Fabien, that they're penalized if they're good communicators. They aren't taken as seriously by their peers. I've heard this especially from women scientists, that if they do outreach, they're thought of as less serious. Does anyone have any thoughts on this and how this might end? How to change this culture?
Well, I know that. Sorry, Monica.
No, go ahead, please.
It's a quick point. I know there is a lot of interest in building more incentive programs around into, let's say, the way academic scientists are evaluated for their work performance. If public communication is something you do on the side, then there's all kinds of reasons not to do it, because your employers are looking for the grants, the papers, that kind of thing. If there's actually interest from the funders, from the employers, or the people who reward the scientists for their work, if public communications is part of that reward system, then there would certainly be a lot of interest in doing it. And I think there is a lot of interest in doing that. If, I told that story about all the scientists and physicians going onto Twitter during COVID because they wanted to share, that tells me that there are a lot of people that would like to do this. They just need a better structure to do it.
Monica, anything to add?
I was going to mention there is movement in changing the reward system. There is push from different fronts to change how that's valued for like tenure and promotion, particularly in academic settings. I mean, I feel like there's also a slow cultural change in how this is being seen. But I think going back to something I said at the beginning, I think this is partially a reflection of dominant perspectives in science. If you are a quote unquote good scientist or good researcher, you must fit these boxes. And if you don't, then you're less than. And so I think there is slow, but systemic change is happening.
You know, I want to talk about trustworthiness a little bit, because I think, and just sort of like challenge assumptions on trustworthiness. I feel like I often hear in my bubble, like, oh, what's wrong with these people who don't trust science, you know? But should we take it as a given that people should trust science?
They should trust trustworthy science. The question is it trustworthy? And how does the public know that it's trustworthy?
And I think, just to add, I think there's also really, science is not one monolithic blob, right? It's all sorts of things. And I think we have this really, really lovely catchphrase. Trust in science is a catchphrase. It's a slogan. But it's actually, when you try and pick it apart, well, what do we mean? Do we mean trust in the institution of science? Trust in the kind of idea of methodological research? Do we trust in specific scientists? I mean, if I don't trust a scientist, is that I don't trust science? I think this idea that there is such a thing as trust in science assumes something that science is, which doesn't exist. So I think we're kind of assuming trust in a non-existent bunch of entities. And I think for me, the classic example is you have science is mobilized as something that people do trust for things that many people in the scientific communities would not view as science. Think about things like trust in, people who trust some alternative medical science or alternative medicine science that most scientific communities will not trust, would not view as scientific. Or you might have to go back to the evolution theory. You have Christian science, which most scientists would not take to be science. But the fact that we even call these things science, that they get called science by the people who use it, shows some mobilization and some idea that this is something you should trust epistemically. We should be committed to, science is good knowledge. But that doesn't mean you trust the scientists or scientists. It doesn't mean you trust necessarily the whole institutions that create science in a formal level, universities, science organizations. Science is more complex than that. So I think to me, it doesn't make sense as a question, actually. The question is, do you trust specific scientists? Do you trust scientific organizations? Do you trust scientific inquiry methods? They have different responses. That's just my hunch.
Monica, anything? Oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
There's a ton of survey research on asking the public, do they trust science? And, across, they do them over time, over location too. And depending how you ask the question, you get very different answers. So sometimes you get the big headline saying, turns out Americans do trust science, but you have to look at how the question was asked. And then there's the caveats, except these Americans, except this kind of science, except this person, so it kind of depends when you ask that question. To Fabien's point, do you trust science, or why don't you trust science? Like which science are we talking about here?
Can you say more about that? Like how that's parsed, how you get different answers depending on how the question is phrased?
Well, it seems like people can give a very generic yes to do you trust science if you're thinking about someone in a white lab coat testing a hypothesis. So if you think about the science you learned in school, yes, people can trust that. But then you say, do you trust, let's say, Anthony Fauci on COVID science? Then you get a really different answer. And it can be because of the nature of the science during COVID. It can be Fauci himself. It can be Fauci's relationship to the US government. Then the question gets more complicated. So which science are we talking about? It actually ends up being really important. I think there should be a lot of work parsing when the publics say yes, when they say no, which publics say yes and which say no under what circumstances, because there's a lot hiding underneath that question. Do you trust science?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, one dimension that I'll add, I think in my work, I think a lot about relationships with people and between individuals or like scientists or institutions that represent science. And one question when people are like, oh, why, like, trust me, I'm a scientist, or why don't people trust science? And I'm like, why should they? Trust has to be earned. And so as a scientist, what have you done to earn the trust of that audience or that person or that group that you want to partner with, that person that you want to have a conversation with? I think sometimes this idea of trust is presented as inherently people should trust science. And I think from the perspective of scientists, scientists tend to think that science is good, that they're good. But I think we really have to question, why should people trust science? I think we need to be a little bit more provocative, and instead of just assuming people should trust science, ask, like, why should they? What have I done as a scientist or as an institution to be trustworthy, especially of groups that are marginalized by science?
I mean, a follow-up to that is, how do we ethically communicate to communities that have been harmed by science in the past?
And I think you have to be aware of these harms. You have to be also reflexive. And when I say reflexive, you have to examine, your own identities, how you move in the world, how you're perceived by people, how you may have contributed to those injustices, unwillingly perhaps, but by the fact of like who you are, where you come from, privileges that you hold, you may be contributing to those systems of injustices. That's a really important thing to consider, to examine when you're relating to communities that have been and continue to be harmed. I think another important question is to ask, am I the right messenger? Like, what is my role in this ecosystem? Again, like in the work that I do with community leaders in Puerto Rico, I know I am often not the best messenger. And so I see my role as a partner, a facilitator. It depends on what that community leader or what the community needs. My role and my relationship with them changes, but I think it's really, really important that we examine, where we come from, who we are, that we know history, that we know, again, the context, the realities of that community, to then determine what's the best way to approach and engage with this community. Should I engage at all? Like, sometimes the answer is no, it's not your place, go away.
What about ethically communicating to individuals or communities who are actually participating in research, who are being researched? Do the ethical obligations change?
Well, I'm familiar with a lot of public health research, sort of ethics of public health research on that takes place in vulnerable communities. And right now, the best practices includes a lot of community engagement, having people within the community, let's say, reviewing the protocols and giving feedback, and then participating, even if it just means sitting on a board, but having eyes on the research. Because if there's one thing that marginalized communities don't appreciate, it's scientists that come in and do research on them, often amplifying the kind of disparities that they want, that they're trying to address, and then not being that helpful when they do their research, publish their paper, and leave. So there's a lot of examples of communities that have pushed back and they say, we want more say, we want to see the final product before you publish it, and that kind of thing. We could think about communications the same way. Ask the communities what kind of information they're looking for, instead of assuming you know what they need.
One thing that's coming to mind, so we're talking about how you address specific communities, but what if your audience is like the whole country of the United States, like what we saw with vaccines, right? Where you really want high vaccine uptake because it will save lives. What's the best approach there? Do you need to sort of segment it off and be like, I'm going to focus on one particular community because it's actually too hard to speak to a huge audience like that because everybody's values are different, or where do you begin? with something like that?
There was some really effective vaccine outreach during COVID, and it was done at the local level. Some of it was grassroots organizations, and they used, what they did was, it was often, because it was lockdown, it was often virtual town hall meetings. It was often looking at a segment, targeting, focused on a segment of the population, let's say a racialized group, a certain community, a religious group, and they would bring in, we've talked about this a few times, community leaders who were trusted and part of those communities because they were the right messenger. And there was tracking of what kind of, this was done sort of early in COVID because there was an anticipation that marginalized communities were less likely to get the COVID vaccine. So they did this directed outreach by community members to the community members, and they tracked it. And there was a movement on the dial of communities that were initially said that vaccine, when it comes, it's not for me. There was much more openness to getting vaccinated after those outreach efforts were made. Some of them worked really well.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is, we talked a lot about the kind of the implausibility of the information deficit model. On the other hand, there is this need for broad information to be shared, right? We need to have some level. So it's not, for me, it's not that we should not communicate information. There is a need for information to be communicated. It's just not enough. Mm-hmm. It's, it acts as a basic platform. But to go back to your question, and this is why I mentioned this, there is some aspect of really broad communication first that we need to do. Absolutely. We need to have this very informative aspect. That's very helpful. It's just not going to get to a whole lot of people. It's going to get to some people, to the maybe a good chunk of the population that are easily accessible through these classic means, and we should absolutely do that. But then there is always people who are just not going to be reached by this, and this is where I think, the kind of smaller communication, we need to do this. And if it is something important like a vaccination drive that needs to get to the whole population, because getting to 60% of the population is just not enough, then we really do need to think about smaller community-led communication. Otherwise, it's pointless.
Yeah, I think we have to take multiple approaches, as what Maya and Fabien have mentioned, to pick up on the example of COVID-19 vaccination in the context of the United States. I was part of I was representing my Ciencia Puerto Rico, one of my organizations, in a coalition that was brought together by a nonprofit that was supported by the federal government, where they brought together all of these community-based or community-engaged organizations across the United States and its territories, and we would get together once a week, sometimes more often, to talk about what are the local needs. How can these national efforts support local needs? So there was some level of coordination between what was happening at the really broad level and what was happening at the local level. So things like that can work. And, there's from the data that I saw from that group, there was, as Maya mentioned, there was movement, there was improvement. But I think, particularly thinking about mass media, one of the things that honestly incredibly frustrated me during the pandemic with COVID-19 vaccination, at least in the US and how this was communicated, is the fact that there was no risk communication at all. It's or very little. It was the vaccine is going to be a silver bullet, and if everybody gets vaccinated, we're going to get out of this like this. That's not true. Any scientist could have told you that's not how it works. There was a lot of talk about herd immunity and getting about to 70% of the population. And, in Puerto Rico, there were cases where the government put out press releases. There's a municipality in Puerto Rico that's an island of the main island of Puerto Rico. It's a place that is incredibly poor. It has undergone historic marginalization at every single level. But it's an island of an island, so it's contained. And the government put out a press release saying tomorrow, Vieques is going to reach 70% of herd immunity. And it's like, that is not how it works. And so I think it was a huge mistake to not talk about vaccines are beneficial. Yes, people should get vaccinated, but these are the limitations. This is not going to be a silver bullet. So I think once we went there, and then the situation continued to evolve, variants, and the vaccines were they were never the silver bullet, but it was obvious they were no longer that silver bullet. That created a lot of problems. So I think in mass communications, we have to be really careful about being open with people about these are the limitations. Here are the things we know. Here are the things that we don't know, and not try to paint this like super rosy picture that it's just not accurate.
Maya, Fabien, are there other fumbles? I feel like we can learn a lot from mistakes. Are
Yep.
there other like big gaffes in science communication that you think of when you're like, oh, that was terrible. That just did not work?
Oh, do you want to go first, Fabien?
I don't think we have time.
I would like to add to
No, you go first.
Oh, we don't have time. I would like to add to Monica's. I think part of I of course watched the COVID vaccine communications very closely, and I'll say I think the first mistake was the way media and government reported Pfizer and Moderna press release information as if it was scientific data, and that was evident if you were paying attention right from the beginning, but you had to look for it in how the communications happen. So back to the silver bullet phrasing, that's because the initial press releases that came out from Pfizer were saying things like 95% efficacy. But when scientists actually combed through the information, they said, sure, 95% efficacy based on a really limited sample and a study that really didn't give us the information that we needed. And that was a time when media and science communicators should have been brave and said, we don't have a lot of information. Of course, everyone wanted the vaccines to work, and we needed good news at the time, but we spun a narrative that just could not hold up because we didn't have the scientific information to back it up. But I think there was so much fear that people wouldn't get vaccinated, and maybe that would make things worse. And at that point, we didn't know. Maybe it would make things worse. Presumably it would, that there was a willingness to go along with it. And those were among the missteps. And we're feeling it now, right? At some point I said, oh my goodness, before you know it, people are going to stop vaccinating their children again. And sure enough, we've now got a drop in childhood vaccinations. The vaccines that we really know work are now in peril again.
I think in some ways for me, there's this idea that keeps coming back, and it's this idea of humility, because I think part of that trope that happens is there is a long running view that we should communicate science for the good, that science is a good thing. It's this very kind of science communication to show how great science is. And so part of it is we don't talk about the risks. We talk about the science of climate change, that science is going to help us solve climate change. We don't so much talk about, for example, the fact that science actually led us to climate change, right? The science of mining has been instrumental to us having climate change and facing climate change. Science is not actually good or bad. Science is a way of knowing it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. Science has given us vaccines and nuclear bomb in equal measures. But the story of science and of science communication tends to shy away from the bad bit, and that's a long-running kind of move within science communication. Mm-hmm. And I think that hinders us from being able to actually engage with science, with where it really sits. It also makes us, I think, uncomfortable with being, intellectually and socially humble about what we can do. So actually, here's what we know. We don't really know much more. We have some limitations. Here's the best we have in terms of knowledge. It's valuable. But that amount of humility of going, actually, we can't really do more than this. Actually, science is not the answer. There was talking about Pfizer. I don't know if you noticed, but they had this ad running during the pandemic, science will win. It's a fantastic poster. It's amazing because actually, it's not the science that wins. It's a science together with social policies, with buy-in, with social cohesion, with all those other things. Science can be amazing. It can give us knowledge that is just astounding. It can shape our lives in the most wonderful ways, and it can be terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
And it has all those potentials. And so I think there is this real challenge in science communication to engage with that humility of going, actually, you know, we have huge limitations in what we know, what we can do, and with that comes an element of comfort with your own ignorance, which I think is a really big challenge for science communication.
And people generally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, Fabien, I think that was incredibly put. I mean, I think going back to what brought us together, it's like ethically, we have to talk about the shortcomings of science. Science communication can't be about cheerleading, just cheerleading for science. Your science is beautiful, it's great, it's fantastic. It has to be about all of the messy bits of science. I think, you know, for those of us, like, I'm doing science communication because I want equity and I want inclusion and I want it to truly be something that benefits people, then I have to be able to talk about all of the things that science is. And as Fabien, as you said, science can be great, but it can also be terrible.
You know, in journalism, we have resources that are helpful, like the AP has a news values and principles statement. You know, almost everywhere I've worked has had an ethics handbook that help us when we're in a sort of confusing situation about what do we do. There's a resource. Do you feel like we need something like that for science communication? Is that not the right answer because it's much bigger? I don't know. What do you all think?
Fabien, you wrote the book. You should answer this question.
Well, yeah. So part of our challenge when we were writing the book with Joan about this was that actually science communication is so broad. It includes public engagement. It includes media. It includes museums and those kind of spaces. So the idea that you can have so clear a code seems really problematic because you're likely to miss people or to shoehorn people into things that are uncomfortable. So for us, the move was rather to create a framework to invite reflection. Because for me, fundamentally, in my background is philosophy. I'm an epistemologist. My background is philosophy and knowledge and those kind of things. And fundamentally, when I think of ethics, the key point of ethics is not what you do so much as how you reflect on what you do. I profoundly believe that doing the right thing without having thought about it doesn't really count so much. What counts more than anything else is having had that process of reflecting on how you make the decisions that you make. But that's not an easy thing to do. Actually, frameworks for reflections are not straightforward. So this is part of what we thought was a move. But absolutely, science communication needs to have the discussion, and the fact that we are having this discussion now says a lot, that this is a moment in science communication where this is something that's being valued. But we need to have the reflections and the systems by which or with which to have those reflections. I think that's incredibly important.
This is a wild card question, and it's because I want to ask it. So is there something missing? And I know this is sort of, it may be at odds with what we've been talking about, but like, do you think there's something missing from mass media about science, like the American Idol for science? Like, is there a version of that where you're like, why hasn't that happened yet? I did say it was a wild card.
Flora, do you have something in mind?
I've just been thinking about like why science media still feels really siloed when science stories to me can be so much about like the messiness of being human, and there's a lot of drama and adventure, and there's a lot of beautiful things to talk about, and also like hard, horrible things, but that touch something deep within us. And I guess I just feel confused why it's its own little niche thing, and there hasn't been like the big wide mass appeal version. So no, I don't have the answer, but that's why I'm asking you.
I mean, I wonder if, I mean, I don't know. I wonder if there's something more about the business of media, because I feel like in media there are other silos. I mean, I feel like politics, it's kind of more, it touches everything, and I think in the stories that you read in other sections of like a newspaper, there are maybe a discussion about political implications, but I feel like as somebody who partners a lot with media, but it's also a consumer of media, it feels like just the nature of how the business is. You know, it's like you have beats. You know, somebody covers politics and there's education. And so there is little about how none of these things happen in a vacuum. But I think for science in particular, perhaps there is a little bit more of that, I don't know, purity mantle of like science is objective and it happens in the ivory tower and it doesn't happen every day. Like there are these kind of like strict definitions of what science means that drive how science is covered, and that drives how science is, the stories are told. I think there is this hesitance about engaging with the messiness of science because it is hard to explain. It's not clear cut. And so I feel like that partly explains why, but I don't have a good answer either.
I think that's right. And I like that idea. It's just to lean into the messiness. We have like 3 minutes left. And I wonder if each one of you could just take a minute to, if there's one idea or one thing you want to leave our audience with on this subject, you know, what would it be?
Let's pick up on the messiness and say science is messy. It can result in very helpful and practical information. It can save lives, that kind of thing. But getting there is usually not straightforward. So the version that we learned in school that's not actually what science looks like. And learning more about the messiness and how it is that we come to scientific agreements is actually really interesting. It's something that you usually don't get to see until you're in university, maybe taking a philosophy of science class or sociology of science. But I think it's worthwhile, and science, learning more about that. You don't have to go back to university to do it, but learning more about the messiness of science, it can actually make you appreciate science rather than think it's something that doesn't actually draw any useful conclusions.
For me, I think that the main thing is for science communication to be more humble about what science can do. Unsurprisingly, I think that's important. But I also think part of that for me is to think about what science can contribute to discussions versus other bits of knowledge. I think there's sometimes a view within the science communication world that science is what's really, really important here. And, I think Monica, at some stage you mentioned, sometimes we shouldn't say anything. That's right. Sometimes science is not the answer. And sometimes science is part of the answer, but sometimes so is other things I'm interested in. For example, how we talk about economics. And I think for climate change, talking about economics.
We lost you, Fabien.
We lost the audio, Fabien.
Fabien, you might be muted. We lost you for a second there, Fabien.
Oh.
You're back.
I don't know why.
Will you just give us the last line? I can't end on a cliffhanger with you. So can you just give us like the last 2 lines of that?
Very good. I think we should be humble about both what we know and also how much science can contribute to discussion. Maybe science is not always the answer. So, what can we know and what should we know socially and what's useful for that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what I'll add to that briefly is I think, I'm very much about what we can do as a community, but communities are composed by individuals. Relationships are built by individuals. So I think I would encourage everyone watching to think about their role as individuals in ethically doing science communication, accepting that we're biased, that we have motivations, kind of thinking about your own role in that ethical science communication. I think it's something that's really important because, we can all do something. And so if we want to continue pushing science communication forward towards more ethical science communication, I think, reflecting on what's our individual roles and wrestling with some of the difficult questions would put forth today. That's what I would encourage people to do.
This was such a great panel. I hope that everyone watching enjoyed it as much as I did. Thank you all. Really, I feel like I learned a ton.
Yeah, thank you all. I just want to come in. This was so thoughtful and thought-provoking. I'm just going to capture someone from the audience said, I vote for no break and to continue the panel discussion. Really great conversation. Thank you all. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Flora, Fabien, and Maya. So much to think on. Our audience had tons of questions, their own ideas, and great conversation happening on the side, which I love to see. Thank you for joining us today. To our audience, stay tuned. We have another panel coming up. We'll be back in about 13 minutes, which is really precise. So be back at 15 hours for our next panel. And thank you all for joining us today. Take care.
Thank you.